The room was electric, the kind of air you could almost taste, thick, buzzing, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. Mike Pence leaned forward, his tone sharpened to a point, and with a measured calm that carried far more venom than volume, he let it slip. "You are nothing but an embarrassment." A mistake. It was the kind of insult that cut deeper because of who it came from. A former vice president, a man long branded as dignified by his supporters, suddenly lashing out with a personal attack. For a split second, the words seemed to hover in the air, unreal, almost unbelievable. Gasps tore through the packed forum. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. The cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of tension, every stiffened posture, every set of eyes darting between the two figures now locked in silent combat. The audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were holding their breath. And across millions of screens nationwide, Americans leaned in. Phones buzzed. Clips began to circulate in real time, captions screaming across feeds. But in that exact moment, inside that hall, it wasn't about social media yet. It was raw. It was shocking. It was the silence after a thunderclap. The nation leaned forward. Had he really just said that? The question ricocheted not only through the audience in the room, but across living rooms, college dorms, coffee shops, and office cubicles everywhere. Could a man who once held the second highest office in the land stoop to such pettiness? Could he really look at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had built her career on resilience and truth, and try to strip her down with one cruel swipe? The tension was unbearable, like a stretched wire about to snap. Crockett hadn't spoken yet. She sat composed, her expression unreadable, her silence more powerful than any words in that moment. Pence shifted slightly, perhaps mistaking her stillness for defeat. But the audience knew better. They had seen this before, a storm gathering behind calm eyes, and then came the whisper of inevitability. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but what Crockett did next wasn't just a response. It was history in the making. The insult didn't exist in a vacuum. This wasn't a quiet exchange between two lawmakers behind closed doors. It was a nationally televised forum, watched by millions, replayed by countless more, dissected by pundits before the dust even had time to settle. The stage itself had been set weeks in advance, billed as a conversation on America's future. The event had promised thoughtful debate and respectful dialogue. What unfolded instead was a powder keg, and Pence had just lit the match. For many, his words weren't just a jab at Jasmine Crockett. They were a signal, a symbol of something much larger, a struggle over identity, dignity, and who gets to define Americanness in 2025. Pence, carrying the polished weight of establishment politics, represented the old guard, a brand of authority that insisted on control through condescension. His comment wasn't merely about Crockett. It was about every voice that had been told they didn't belong, every leader whose legitimacy had been questioned not because of their ability, but because of who they were, and that's why the room reacted the way it did. It wasn't just the audacity of the insult, it was the historic weight of it. A man once a heartbeat away from the presidency had tried to reduce a sitting congresswoman to nothing more than a mistake. That sting cut far beyond the stage. Reporters scrambled to tweet out fragments of the moment. Producers whispered urgently in control booths, cameras shifting angles to capture Crockett's every blink, every inhale. On social media, the early posts were already climbing. Did Pence really just call her a mistake? This is unreal. Jasmine Crockett about to end him. The frenzy was instantaneous and it was growing, but inside the hall, time seemed to slow. Crockett hadn't spoken yet. She didn't need to. The quiet steadiness in her posture was louder than any protest. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't flustered. She looked like someone who had walked into storms before and learned how to harness the thunder. And that was the thing Pence hadn't understood. She was built for this. Her career, her advocacy, her very presence on that stage had been shaped by battles far uglier and stakes far higher than a petty insult. She had been doubted, dismissed, underestimated, and every time she had answered with substance, clarity, and an unshakable belief in her own worth, the audience could feel it. They weren't just waiting for her response. They were bracing for it. They knew she wasn't going to trade barbs for barbs. They knew she was going to do something more devastating, transform the insult into a lesson, flip arrogance into shame, and remind the nation why she belonged not just on that stage, but in the heart of America's story. And as the silence stretched on, tension rising like a crescendo, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. She had faced bigger storms, and she knew how to turn words into weapons. But before she struck, the world needed to see exactly who she was up against. To understand the weight of Mike Pence's words, you have to understand the man who spoke them. For years, Pence had cultivated an image, calm, polished, disciplined, the quiet counterpart to louder, more chaotic figures in his party. He was the measured voice, the one who claimed to bring dignity to a movement that thrived on division. And yet beneath the surface of that polished veneer was something else, a thread of arrogance stitched tightly into his public persona. Pence had built his career on presenting himself as a man of principle, a devout guardian of tradition. He leaned into scripture, cloaked himself in the language of morality, and spoke with the cadence of someone who believed history itself would side with him. To his supporters he was steady, a moral compass in turbulent waters. But to his critics that composure was a mask, one that hid a condescending streak, a tendency to lecture rather than listen, to diminish rather than engage. Over the years, he had mastered the art of speaking down while smiling. His words carried a sting, even when delivered in soft tones, like a velvet glove covering an iron fist. He claimed to respect the democratic process, but he often framed dissenting voices as misguided, lesser, even dangerous. And when confronted with leaders who didn't fit his vision of American tradition, he didn't hesitate to cast them aside with a quiet but cutting dismissal. That night was no different. When Pence called Jasmine Crockett a mistake, it wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was the culmination of decades of habit, the ease with which he diminished anyone who didn't fit neatly into the image of leadership he approved. His smile as he delivered it wasn't warmth. It was condescension dressed as calm. But what Pence failed to see was that the very arrogance he wore as armor was beginning to crack. The political landscape had shifted. His once unchallenged authority was now constantly under scrutiny. He was a man trying to command a room that no longer belonged to him. The younger generation of leaders, fierce, diverse, unapologetically bold, weren't intimidated by his soft-spoken scorn. They had grown up under the shadow of men like him and learned how to resist with fire and grace. And the contradictions in Pence's public life only made his words land harder. This was a man who preached about humility while standing in judgment over others. A man who spoke of unity while dismissing those who didn't share his worldview. He had spent years branding himself as a moral authority, but time and again, his actions betrayed a hunger for control disguised as conviction. The audience felt those contradictions in the moment. Some gasped, others muttered under their breath. Even those who once admired him were left uneasy. They weren't just hearing a sharp insult. They were witnessing the unraveling of a persona that had taken decades to build. Pence's words revealed the very arrogance he had tried to conceal, and in doing so, he exposed a truth. The old ways of belittling and silencing were losing their grip, and while Pence believed he had delivered a devastating blow, he was blind to what was about to come. For in trying to humiliate Crockett, he had given her the perfect stage, the perfect contrast, the perfect opportunity to embody everything he was not. Calm where he was patronizing, dignified where he was arrogant, truthful where he was hollow. It was the oldest story in politics, the powerful underestimating those they sought to belittle. And time and again, history showed how that arrogance turned into downfall. Pence had taken the first step toward his own undoing, and he didn't even know it. The cameras stayed fixed on his face, capturing the smug curve of his smile. But just off frame, Jasmine Crockett was preparing. And when she stepped into the spotlight, Pence would discover that he hadn't silenced her at all. He had awakened her, but Rudy had no idea who he had provoked. No, this time it was Pence, and what he had ignited would soon erupt into a moment no one in that hall or across the nation would ever forget. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's response would resonate so powerfully, you have to trace the steps of her journey. Hers is not the story of a politician born into privilege, groomed for power, and shielded from hardship. It is the story of a woman who built herself in the crucible of struggle, who learned early that dignity is not given, it is defended. Crockett's path began not in grand halls of influence, but in classrooms and neighborhoods where voices like hers were often overlooked. She was the daughter of a community that knew sacrifice as daily bread and resilience as a way of life. In those early years, she watched her elders work tirelessly, often receiving little recognition for their efforts. That silence, the way contributions were erased or diminished, planted in her a conviction. She would not allow her voice, or the voices of those she represented, to be dismissed. Her legal career became the first arena where that conviction burned bright. She entered courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients, immigrants facing a system designed to intimidate them, families cornered by bureaucracy, individuals fighting for rights most others took for granted. And time after time, Crockett transformed those courtrooms into stages where dignity was defended. She wasn't just arguing cases. She was narrating the stories of people who had been silenced. Judges and juries alike could feel it. The weight of her words wasn't just legal reasoning. It was lived truth, that ability to turn pain into persuasion, injustice into firepower, followed her into public office. She became a voice for the marginalized, not by moderating her tone to appease the powerful, but by amplifying the raw, unapologetic reality of her community. For every door that was closed to her, she knocked louder. For every insult hurled her way, she sharpened her resolve. Critics called her fiery, too outspoken, too bold. But those who knew her story understood. What they called fire was really survival refined into strength. In Crockett's journey, there are echoes of historic figures. Leaders who carried the weight of entire communities on their shoulders, who turned ridicule into resilience. Like them, she learned that the ability to stand tall in the face of arrogance wasn't about ego. It was about duty. She wasn't fighting for herself alone. She was carrying the names and faces of those who had been ignored for generations. Every debate, every confrontation was bigger than her. That night, when Pence's insult landed in the hall, it wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed as a mistake. Variations of that word had shadowed her throughout her career. Too loud, too unpolished, too different. But where others heard critique, she heard confirmation that she was shaking the ground where comfort once reigned. To her, being called a mistake by men in power was proof that she was exactly where she needed to be. And yet, what set Crockett apart wasn't just her resilience. It was her composure. Under fire, she did not rush. She did not stumble. She understood the theater of politics, the cameras, the headlines, the whispers that turned into roars. She knew that dignity performed under pressure becomes something greater. It becomes memory. A story that audiences retell, a legacy that lingers. As the lights burned down on that forum and the insult echoed, Crockett's presence began to shift the energy in the room. People who had braced themselves for a fight now leaned forward, sensing something different. They recognized that calm in her eyes, the same calm she had shown in courtrooms stacked with opposition, in hearings where her words were twisted, in interviews where her voice was mocked. It was the calm of someone who knew storms and refused to be drowned by them. The truth is, Crockett's story had prepared her for Pence's arrogance long before he ever spoke. She knew men like him, polished, certain, armored in tradition. She had faced their dismissals before, but what he didn't know was that every insult he offered only gave her more material, more fuel, more reason to transform the moment into history. And history was exactly what she was about to create. Because when she opened her mouth to respond, she wasn't just answering for herself. She was answering for every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, for every woman who had been told she was too much, for every community dismissed as unworthy of power. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were seconds away from witnessing a clapback that would transcend politics. It would become a lesson, a rallying cry, an unforgettable assertion of dignity against condescension. When she spoke, the room, and the country, would feel the weight of her presence. And Pence, who thought his insult had landed a finishing blow, was about to learn the oldest truth in history. Underestimate the resilient, and you set the stage for your own undoing. And as Crockett drew a breath, the atmosphere tightened. The world leaned in, waiting. What came next would ignite not just the forum, but an entire movement. The insult still hung in the air, sharp and cutting, when the forum moderator tried, and failed, to move the conversation along. Cameras zoomed in on Pence, his expression set in that familiar mask of sanctimony, his shoulders squared as though he had landed a masterstroke. He sat back slightly, lips curved into the faintest smile, the look of a man convinced that the room belonged to him. But it didn't. A low murmur rippled across the audience, like the sound of waves gathering force before they crash. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered sharply to their neighbors. The tension was alive now, humming against the lights, bouncing from wall to wall. Every lens in the room seemed to lock onto Jasmine Crockett. Would she lash out? Would she falter? Or would she, like so many before her, swallow the insult in silence? She didn't rush. Crockett sat steady, her eyes fixed on Pence. Her calmness, her refusal to flinch, was a statement in itself. The silence that stretched between them wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Every second she let pass reminded the room that arrogance has a way of talking itself into a corner. Pence, however, mistook the silence for victory. He leaned forward again, emboldened, adding fuel to the fire. He taunted her with that clipped, almost preacherly tone he often used in debates, calm on the surface but dripping with condescension underneath. He spoke of serious leaders and real statesmen, the kind of words meant to frame himself as the adult in the room while diminishing her as an amateur. The audience caught it. They always do. Gasps, sighs, even a stifled laugh from somewhere in the back. The crowd wasn't with him, not fully, not anymore. Still, Pence pressed on. He spoke over her, raising his voice just enough to try to eclipse hers. Each interruption was another attempt to reclaim control of the narrative, to remind the audience of his seniority. But in doing so, he revealed what he did not intend, a nervous edge. His hand fidgeted with the pen in front of him. He shifted in his chair. That smug smile flickered, almost imperceptibly, as if he sensed he had gone too far. And all the while, Crockett stayed composed. Her eyes scanned the audience, catching the expressions of disbelief, the raised eyebrows, the tightened jaws. She let them sit in the discomfort of his arrogance, let them taste it, so that when her turn came, her words would land like a thunderbolt. The escalation was reaching its peak. Every line Pence delivered only deepened the contrast. His condescension against her calm, his bluster against her poise. The room was now divided into two energies, one man trying to assert control, and one woman quietly gathering power. And then it happened. Crockett shifted slightly in her seat, leaning forward just enough to signal that her silence was over. The movement was subtle, but the effect was electric. Conversation stopped mid-whisper. The moderator glanced toward her. Even Pence, for the briefest of moments, hesitated. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult spoken that night. It was the kind of silence that announces a turning point. The kind that tells you history is about to pivot. The audience didn't need to be told. They knew. They could feel it building. That she had allowed Pence to dig himself into arrogance so deep that the ground beneath him was ready to collapse. And then Crockett leaned in, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The air in the hall tightened, as though every pair of lungs had been caught mid-breath, and silence fell like a drumbeat across the hall. The clapback, the moment no one expected, was about to begin. The silence stretched on, sharp and unbearable, until Crockett finally let her voice cut through it. Calm, low, controlled. "Mr. Pence," she began, her tone carrying the weight of a reprimand without ever raising her voice. "I want to thank you for reminding this room exactly why so many Americans are tired of politics as usual." The line was precise, surgical. It wasn't just directed at him. It was aimed at the audience, the cameras, the millions who would later watch the clip online. Instantly, murmurs broke out. She had reframed the insult, turned it into a revelation about him, not her. Pence's smirk faltered, but Crockett didn't stop there. She leaned in, her eyes locked on his, delivering each word with the precision of a scalpel. "You call yourself a man of principle, yet what I hear is arrogance dressed up as leadership. You call yourself a man of faith, yet your words reek of disdain for anyone who doesn't fit your narrow mold. And tonight, in this forum, you decided that dismissing me would somehow elevate you. But let me remind you, arrogance never ages well. History always finds it out." The crowd erupted. Gasps, applause, a chorus of "That's right," from the back rows. Pence's face stiffened. He shifted in his chair, the small movements of a man who suddenly found the spotlight too bright. Crockett wasn't finished. She straightened, her voice rising just enough to command every corner of the hall. "I was raised to believe that public service means listening before you speak, lifting others up rather than tearing them down. So, when you tell me I'm unfit to lead, what you're really saying is that you cannot imagine someone who looks like me, who comes from where I come from, standing equal to you." "That's not a reflection of me, sir. That's a mirror held up to you." The words hit like lightning. The audience was on its feet now, clapping, cheering, drowning out even the moderator's pleas for order. The clip was already being clipped by phones, already destined to go viral within minutes, and Crockett delivered the final blow, the true mic drop. She leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping again into that calm, deliberate register, the kind of tone that makes people lean in because they know the most important part is coming. "You see, Mike, the mistake wasn't me being on this stage. The mistake was you underestimating me on it." The room exploded. Applause thundered. Some shouted, "Say it again." Others shook their heads, grinning in disbelief at the audacity, the precision, the brilliance of the clapback. Pence sat frozen, blinking rapidly, trying to recalibrate, trying to form words that would undo the damage. But the damage was already done. The cameras zoomed in, one tight on Pence's stiff jaw, another on Crockett's steady gaze, then wide on the audience, still on its feet. It was the perfect cinematic split screen, arrogance unraveling on one side, composure shining on the other, and Crockett, knowing the moment belonged to her now, did not gloat. She didn't sneer or throw in another insult. Instead, she let the silence of her final line hang, the applause washing over her like vindication. She smiled softly, dignified, assured, and then leaned back in her chair, signaling with her body language that she had said everything she needed to say. The moderator scrambled to regain control, fumbling through questions, but the debate had shifted irreversibly. The focus wasn't on policy talking points anymore. It wasn't on the planned agenda. It was on that moment, the insult, the clapback, the collapse of Pence's carefully crafted composure. Even the audience sensed it. The rest of the forum passed in a blur, with Pence attempting to regain footing, offering clipped answers, trying to redirect, but each word fell flat. Crockett, meanwhile, commanded attention with every statement, her authority elevated by the confrontation she had just navigated with poise and precision. Reporters in the room scribbled furiously, not about tax policy or foreign affairs, but about the clash. Phones buzzed as clips were shared, as hashtags were born, as memes were already forming in real time. It wasn't just a counterattack. It was a cultural moment, and as the debate wound down and the audience began to file out, the buzz in the air was undeniable. People whispered to each other about what they had just witnessed. They laughed, they shook their heads, they replayed her words over and over again. Pence's name was on their lips, yes, but not as victor, not as elder statesman. He was the man who underestimated Jasmine Crockett and paid the price on live television. The clip was destined to dominate headlines, saturate social media feeds, and carve itself into the memory of political history. And the best part, Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had redefined the entire power dynamic of the night. The nation would soon be watching, dissecting, laughing, cheering. But in that moment, inside that hall, one truth was already clear. Mike Pence had tried to dismiss her with arrogance. Jasmine Crockett had answered with dignity, precision, and fire. And in that clash, she didn't just win the exchange. She created a moment that would echo far beyond the debate stage, and the shockwaves were only beginning. By the time the debate wrapped, the world outside the hall had already shifted. Phones buzzed with notifications, timelines filled with the same clip replayed from a dozen angles. 1 second, Pence's insult. The next, Crockett's poised, devastating clapback. It was everywhere. On Twitter, the hashtags materialized almost instantly. Your Crockett clapback, history made, your Pence shut down. Within an hour, they were trending across the nation. A 15-second clip, trimmed by someone in the audience, had already crossed 500,000 views. By dawn, it would hit millions more. Commentators scrambled to weigh in. Some called it the political moment of the year. Others, clearly rattled by Crockett's composure, tried to downplay it as theatrics. But the narrative was already slipping out of their control. What people were sharing wasn't spin. It was the raw footage of Pence unraveling, and Crockett rising above him. On Instagram, Reels looped Crockett's final line, The mistake wasn't me being on this stage. The mistake was you underestimating me on it. Paired with dramatic music edits, it spread like wildfire. TikTok creators layered the moment with reaction videos. Jaws dropping, eyes widening, friends high-fiving as they mouthed her words in sync. And then came the memes. Pence's frozen expression was screenshotted, captioned, repurposed. Side-by-side comparisons emerged. Crockett's calm smile versus his strained glare. Someone stitched it with a clip of a referee counting out a boxer on the mat. Another labeled Pence, yesterday's America, and Crockett, tomorrow's America. The internet, once again, had crowned its winner, but it wasn't just online banter. Cable news shows couldn't resist running the segment on loop. On MSNBC, anchors marveled at Crockett's composure. CNN analysts dissected the body language, the raised brows, the smirk wiped clean. Even Fox News, in attempting to spin it, gave the clip more airtime than anything else. Meanwhile, public figures began to chime in. Celebrities reposted the clip with fire emojis. Civil rights leaders praised Crockett for embodying dignity in the face of arrogance. Progressive politicians tweeted lines of support, some even admitting, "That was one of the best clapbacks I've ever seen." And then the ripple spread deeper. Ordinary Americans, immigrants, young activists, women of color, people who had often felt dismissed in political spaces, flooded comment sections with gratitude. "She spoke for all of us," one user wrote. Another, "I've been told my whole life that I don't belong at the table. Tonight, Crockett reminded me I do." For Pence, the fallout was harsher. Conservative commentators, usually quick to circle wagons, grew uneasy. Some criticized his lack of discipline. Others lamented that he walked into a trap. The headlines told the story clearly. Crockett outshines Pence in debate clash. Moment of the night, Crockett's clapback. Pence left speechless. And through it all, Crockett herself said little. She didn't need to. Her silence online became its own statement. The quiet confidence of someone who knew the moment spoke louder than any follow-up tweet. The next morning, Good Morning America replayed the clip to a national audience, describing it as a defining exchange in modern political debates. By evening, late-night hosts were weaving it into monologues, complete with audience laughter at Pence's expense. What had begun as a cutting insult turned into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. But beneath the noise, something more lasting was happening. Crockett's words were being clipped, saved, and shared not just as entertainment but as inspiration. Teachers played it in classrooms. Community groups replayed it in meetings. Activists cited it in speeches. The moment transcended debate night drama. It became a symbol, and in that symbol lay the true shockwave. Crockett had reframed what leadership looked like. She had shown that strength could coexist with dignity, that being underestimated could transform into undeniable power. Millions of viewers, many who had never tuned into a debate before, felt seen, validated, energized. It wasn't just politics anymore. It was a cultural turning point, and as the hashtags multiplied, as memes spread, as newscasters analyzed and communities celebrated, one question hung in the air. If one clapback could shake a debate, what could happen if that energy became a movement? The answer was waiting in the resolution, a lesson bigger than the clash itself. When the dust settled and the digital storm began to quiet, something deeper emerged from the chaos. Beyond the hashtags and viral edits, there was a truth that couldn't be drowned out. Dignity had triumphed over arrogance. Jasmine Crockett's moment wasn't just about silencing Mike Pence. It was about proving that composure could stand taller than condescension, that courage could disarm the sharpest insult. Her words weren't delivered in anger. They weren't born of pettiness. They carried the weight of history, the echoes of every time someone told a young woman of color that she didn't belong, every time an immigrant was made to feel like an outsider, every time dignity was mistaken for weakness. Her clapback was more than a comeback. It was a reminder. True leadership doesn't come from the volume of your voice, but from the values behind it. Pence tried to belittle her with a sneer. She answered with substance. He swung with arrogance. She countered with grace. And in that contrast, America saw the difference between politics as performance and politics as principle. The moral wasn't confined to a single debate hall. It stretched outward, touching anyone who had ever been underestimated. Crockett had turned a personal attack into a universal message. You are not a mistake. Your presence matters. Your voice belongs here. For every student sitting in a classroom where they feel invisible. For every worker fighting to be taken seriously. For every activist shouted down by louder, older voices. Crockett's moment carried their story too. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Power rooted in arrogance will always crack when it collides with dignity. It may sneer, it may jeer, it may even dominate for a time. But when the spotlight shines brightest, arrogance folds under the weight of truth. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She revealed what strength looks like when it refuses to stoop to the level of insult, and in doing so, she reframed the future. Because politics isn't just about policies, it's about presence. It's about who we see standing on those stages and what they represent to the millions watching. Crockett's stance, calm, resolute, unwavering, reminded people that representation isn't symbolic. It's transformative. For the audience at home, the moral resonated on a personal level. Many saw themselves in her resilience. They recognized the quiet fury of being dismissed, the patience it takes to endure mockery, and the courage it requires to answer not with anger, but with clarity. Her moment told them that their own battles, in workplaces and families and communities, could also be won with dignity and tact. And that is where the story transcended politics. Because this wasn't only about Crockett or Pence, it was about the enduring question of what America chooses to celebrate. Will we honor the sneers, the interruptions, the dismissals? Or will we lift up the ones who, even when under attack, answer with words that remind us who we are at our best? In the end, Crockett's victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who has ever been silenced but refused to stay silent. To everyone who has ever been underestimated but refused to shrink. To everyone who has ever been told they were a mistake but proved, by their very presence, that they were the possibility of tomorrow. And so, the moral of that unforgettable night stood clear. Dignity is not weakness. Composure is not silence. And when arrogance tries to erase you, the most powerful weapon you hold is your unshakable truth. Because justice isn't only won in courts or chambers. Sometimes it's won in a single sentence that reverberates across the nation and leaves history nodding in agreement. But the story couldn't end here. There was one final chapter, a call to those who had witnessed it all, to carry the fire forward. Mike Pence thought he could dismiss Jasmine Crockett with a few careless words. He thought his insult would land, diminish, and define her. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. Her clapback didn't just silence him in that moment, it rewrote the story. It reminded the nation that arrogance may roar, but dignity endures. This was more than politics. This was a reminder of why voices like Crockett's matter and why her presence on that stage cannot be ignored. She stood as proof that you don't need to shout to be heard, you don't need to conform to be respected, and you don't need permission to claim your space in America's story. That is what made her response unforgettable. That is why this moment will live far beyond a single debate. And now, it's in your hands. If you felt the power of her words, if you believe dignity deserves the last word over arrogance, then don't let this story stop here. Share it. Pass it forward. Add your voice to the chorus that says we will not be silenced, we will not be erased, and we will not mistake condescension for strength, because every view, every share, every conversation sparked by this video is part of something bigger. A movement of people who believe in justice, in courage, in truth that speaks louder than insult. So if this moment struck you, subscribe for more, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and carry the lesson into your own battles, however small or large. Justice isn't a word from the past. It's the voice we carry forward. And tonight, Jasmine Crockett showed us exactly how powerful that voice can be.